Hi, let's talk about managing international operations. This lecture is on operations management, and as such it includes a number of topics related to the choice of location, to the capacity planning, to certification and standardization, and all kinds of other things that fall under this umbrella. So let's talk about them one by one. First, capacity planning. It is always difficult to predict how many units of your product or service you will need to deliver in the next quarter or year. And the task is always much more difficult when you operate internationally. As you understand, factors such as economy, consumer demand, financial health of your company, all those matter. And the problem is that even predicting your domestic economy, how it's going to do in the next year, is almost impossible. Now imagine that you do business in multiple countries, and now you have to know how the global economy will do, as well as how the local economies will do where you do business. And then obviously if you overproduce your product, then you will be left with a pile of items that nobody wants to buy, with your money tied in them, and so you will lose. But then at the same time, if you produce too few items, then obviously you may lose some potential revenue, and so that becomes a very important task. Even more importantly is that if you plan, for example, on making more units than the market will actually need, the thing is that you will probably hire more people, and when you eventually realize that you can't sell all your products, you will be faced with the difficult task of laying off your people because you have more than what you actually need. I'll give you a couple of examples from Europe where the laws are much more in favor of the employees rather than the employers, or labor laws, right? For example, a friend of mine, actually a colleague of mine, a professor back in Canada, has a brother, and his brother works in Europe, in France, as a middle-level bank manager. A few years ago, the bank where my colleague's brother worked at that time was acquired by another bank, and I believe it was an American bank that acquired that bank in France. And so when the two merged together, the new owners, the new management, decided to lay off some people. Now in France, it's not so easy to do. In most cases, the laws are designed in such a way that it's very difficult to get rid of people. We're not going to debate here whether or not it's good or bad for the economy. I will just tell you that as an employer myself, back when I managed a business and employed people, I would have hated laws like that, because what if there is someone who works for you who for whichever reason is not good for your company? Maybe doesn't do a good job, or maybe you just don't like the person. In my case, I had a small company with about a dozen employees, actually even fewer than that, so we had about 9 people, and so I would communicate with each of them on a daily basis, and obviously any problems interpersonally would kind of make life miserable for me as a manager, for them as employees. And so if there was a law that would say that you cannot lay off or fire a person, then you as the company owner, you are not in a very good situation. At the same time, as an employee, I kind of like the situation where you as an employee are protected, that you will not be fired just because your boss doesn't like you for whatever reason. The same thing from the economic point of view. I mean, some say that it's essential for the economy to give the management the freedom of hiring and firing people at will. But then at the same time, some other economists say that when it is difficult to lay off people, then in the times of the economic downturn, companies will not overfire, because once something goes wrong, companies, just to be safe, get rid of all the ballast, including people, which only aggravates the economic problems, because the more people are out of work, the fewer customers are out there, then which means the demand for your product goes even lower, which means you have to lay off even more people, which means there will be even fewer customers, and so on and so on and so on. And so this vicious cycle basically starts the downward spiral. And so in the societies where the laws are not very protective of the employees, the economic crises tend to be deeper. Then, for example, in countries where most labor is unionized and where over firing as well as maybe over hiring is a little bit difficult. But anyway, let's get back to our story about the French banker. So the company he worked for was acquired, and so the new management decided that not so many people are needed now, and so he was laid off. But luckily for him, the French laws say that once you work for the company for a certain number of years, and I'm not sure what exactly those years are, but in his case he was entitled for 1 year full pay severance package. So the guy loses his job and gets a paycheck for his whole year's salary. Now he finds another job within 2 weeks and gets that job, and so he basically just got himself a 1 year bonus for switching jobs. Now the problem is that if you happen to operate in one of those countries and you have to get rid of some people, it may be extremely costly. It may actually be cheaper for you to just keep them there, maybe put them or move them to the part-time positions or something else. But again, over planning the capacity may be a huge and very costly mistake. Now, when you are trying to consider how many people you would need, and even more importantly, how much those people will cost you, one of the biggest challenges is that you will have to look at a very wide range of factors. Most people normally would think that, well, when I'm estimating how much my labor will cost me, I should look at how much I will be paying those people and how much they will be working me. Wages, basically, or annual salaries. But it turns out that there are many more factors that determine how much your labor will actually cost you. So obviously it's wages, but then also productivity. I mean, some labor may be more expensive, but much more productive. Training cost, turnover, absenteeism, taxes, pension plans, health insurance, required benefits. All those kinds of things are part of the labor cost. Now, I'll give you a few examples. For example, when you go to Detroit, and you look at where those car companies as well as companies that make parts and supplies and components for cars, where they employ people, you will notice that many of them actually work in Canada, just across the border, in Windsor and those other cities there in Ontario. You would think, why? Labor, the medium wage and the minimum wage is generally higher in Canada, even though on average Americans make slightly more than Canadians. But the minimum wage and the medium wage in Canada is higher, which means that there are many super rich people like Bill Gates in the United States that pulls the average to the rich side. But when you look at the kind of middle class, actually Canadians are a little bit richer there. And so as I said, their minimum wages are substantially higher actually, and then even the medium wage is higher. So the question is then, why all those Michigan companies choose to employ people in Canada and not in the United States, even though wages in the United States are somewhat lower? And there are several reasons for that. One, in the United States, on top of wages, most companies would have to provide some form of health insurance to their employees. And especially if the company is unionized, as is the case with most of the automotive companies, it may be a substantial amount of money. I don't know how much it is for those kinds of jobs. I can tell you how much the University of North Carolina, Greensboro pays for my health insurance. Now, mine is completely covered by the employer. My family's insurance is covered, I believe it's 50% by the employer. I pay the other 50%. So that other 50% is about $500 per month. So the total package is roughly $2,000 per month, of which I pay about $500, which means my employer, the UNCG, pays another $1,500 or so every month, which is basically per year another $20,000. If the university hired me in Canada, they wouldn't have to pay that, because in Canada healthcare is free. It's completely covered by the state. And so by moving to Canada, the company may pay a little tiny bit more for the wages. It will be like 5% higher in Canada or something like that. But they will save this huge expense, which is healthcare. Additionally, absenteeism in Canada tends to be a little lower because healthcare is free, people are not concerned when they have to go and see a doctor. Like for example here, again, I'm not sure what kind of insurance you have, but my insurance as a federal employee, as a state employee, university employee, I have one of the probably better insurance packages. And so when I have to see my family physician, me or kid, that's right there at $35. Specialist, another $70. So total, just go sneeze, go see a doctor, go see a specialist, you're down over $100 right there. Now, to me, I can still afford, even though I kind of think twice before I go to see a doctor. But for some people, especially those who don't have insurance, or those who do have insurance but don't make much money, that's a huge expense. And so what often happens is that people in the United States kind of wait too long and go and see a doctor only when they really, really need to see a doctor. In Canada, since the state pays for the whole healthcare system, there is a huge emphasis on preventive care, because every time I get sick, that's the Ministry of Health paying for my, basically covering my bills. So not only they invest more money in vaccination and other preventive measures, but also they're kind of fine with people, I wouldn't call it abusing the system, but going to see the doctor too often. When I lived in Canada, literally, my kid sneezes, I go and see 2 doctors and sometimes even 3, just in case. It doesn't cost me a penny. And so that definitely increases the pressure on the healthcare system and makes it a little bit more expensive as far as, paying for the doctor's visits. But at the same time, it hugely reduces the rate of people getting sick. And so when you look, for example, at the Canadian healthcare cost per capita and the American healthcare cost per capita, Canadians pay about 45% of what Americans are paying, but at the same time they get sick much less often. Now, going back to the business context, what that means is that in Canada, you would expect your people to be absent due to sickness. Either they getting ill or their kids getting sick. So that would happen much less often, and that's also part of your labor cost, because if your employee gets sick, in most cases you would have to keep paying the salary to that person, and then more importantly, your workflow is disrupted, you have to find substitutes, or you produce less, and so that's all a substantial additional cost. And so by, as I said, moving, for example, to Canada, you can save as an employer an additional $3,000, $5,000, even $6,000, depending on what kind of package you would be offering here in the United States for the medical care, and would not have to offer in Canada that package because it's already included for free for the taxes that the people pay there. So all those things might be taken into account, or need to be taken into account. Additionally, for example, when you go to Africa, due to malaria and some other widespread diseases, the absenteeism rate may be easily 40% or even higher, which means you have to hire almost twice as, well, not quite twice, 40% more people than, actually no, twice as many almost people, just in case they get sick. And so, as I said, they do get sick a lot because of all those infectious diseases going on there. And so often that's a huge problem. And so you basically, even though wages may be extremely low, but they effectively going to be double that, because you'll have to train up twice as many people, keep on the payroll twice as many people, have additional logistical challenges, shuffling those people, those who could come, who couldn't. Huge deal. For example, Monsanto, when they first started doing business in Africa, when they were faced with this huge problem of absenteeism due to sickness, they thought, well, maybe we have to do something about malaria. And so what they did was they sprayed all the premises of the company with some kind of chemicals that kill mosquitoes. But the problem was that, as you know, the wind blows and brings new mosquitoes in. So eventually they had to spray the whole town, and it's a lot of cost. But again, that didn't help. I mean, big deal. Town, again, wind comes and mosquitoes from other towns or forests are blown into your, area where you hire your people. And so eventually they went as far as spraying the entire county, and then they eventually built up a like a network of better employers who were eventually spraying almost the entire country where they operated to minimize the problem. And so I've heard that a presentation or a story about that at the Academy of Management conference, and the theme of the conference was doing well by doing good. And so the point there was that even though it's a lot of money for the company, and even though it kind of looks like it's nice social project, help people be healthier, but what they really were after was, doing well, so for the bottom line. And so all that extra expense, given the huge absenteeism rate due to sickness, was actually paying off, and so they were doing better financially by doing good to the people who worked for them. Now, the same thing when you choose the location. There are so many factors that need to be considered, and when you go international, the number of factors only increases, which makes the decision on where exactly you want to make a product even more challenging. So not only you would look at the labor cost as wages or salaries or medical benefits that you would need to offer or anything else that you would need to offer by law. Obviously, it would also include questions like, for example, where would you have the most skilled people? What would be the transportation cost, either delivering the raw materials to your site or maybe then transporting the finished goods? Proximity to suppliers, customers, resources, airports, highways, ports, other infrastructure. All those are very important questions. Tax break, taxes, import tariffs, credit availability, labor capital intensity, all those kinds of things, risks of currency fluctuations, public relations. All those are very important questions, and you will have to deal with them. For example, going back to compensation packages, vacation days. In some countries, like in the United States, if you are a contract worker, there may be no vacation days whatsoever. Or there may be a few days per year only. If you go to, for example, Europe, in many countries you will be required by law to offer over 30 days a year of vacation. And so there is a joke that in France you have to work only 2 weeks a year, and obviously it's exaggerated, but yes, I mean, you would have to pay for many more vacation days where people get paid but not doing any work for you. When we talk about labor intensity and capital intensity, well, there are some products that are made pretty much all by robots. Like, for example, when you take things like, well, can you actually think of products that are made almost entirely by robots, where humans literally just push the button at the beginning of the shift and then push the button at the end of the shift, and that's all that's done. And obviously I'm exaggerating here, there is a little bit more work here, but briefly speaking, that's how it's done. Well, most people think of things as computers or some other high-tech equipment, and I'm not sure why. I mean, strictly speaking, computers, as you know, are actually assembled largely by hand, and this is why, by the way, most of them are made in low labor cost countries. But for example, carpets and socks are made normally in the United States. There are huge factories in Arkansas and Kansas that make those two products, and apparently they are almost fully automated processes. So nobody makes socks by hand anymore, obviously. So, and apparently as long as you have that string or whatever they use, that fiber that they use to make the socks, I mean, everything else is made by computers. From actually weaving the socks to packaging them, and then, people are literally doing very little work. So there are just a few engineers who make sure that the equipment works, and that's it. The same thing with carpets. So if you have one of those capital intensive productions where labor is minimal, it's all about machines doing stuff, then perhaps it's a good idea to keep the production facilities in the United States. Labor is expensive here, but you don't need much of it. At the same time, if you have a product that is very labor intensive, lots of manual labor going into it, well, obviously that's a product that you would like to make in a country, that you want to make in a country where labor is cheap, and so choose something like China or, I don't know, Malaysia or one of those countries. Now, here is your question. So let's see if you would know the answer to this one. And the correct answer is, obviously it is E. That's how we discussed it. Now, here I wanted to show you a little video or a documentary about Body Glove, the guys who make all those wetsuits and other equipment for swimming. Now, I'm not going to incorporate it in the lecture. I'm going to post it as a separate file on the Blackboard in case you want to watch it. Just an interesting video that focuses on some of the tough choices related to location and business outsourcing that Body Glove had to make. So, but anyway, for now, let's move on. If you want to pause here and watch the video now, that's fine. If you want to watch it after the lecture, that's fine too. Now, another big choice you will have to make is whether you would like to make all the components on your own, or if you would like to outsource it to other companies. As you understand, for example, cars, right? So GM doesn't make cars 100%. So they buy all kinds of components from other companies. They would buy electrical motors, tires, windshields, paint, oil, all kinds of rubber seals, and all kinds of things that go into the car. And strictly speaking, most of the automakers make only what? Design the car, make engines probably, and probably not even all of them make engines, but most, I suppose, make engines, maybe some other components. But all those other little things, wheel bearings, probably even seats, who knows what else, are made by their partners. So they would outsource production of those components, and then they just do the final assembly. And so one of the choices you will have is whether or not you want to make every single component of your product, whatever that product is, or if you would like to outsource some or maybe even all of it. Like for example Nike, they don't make shoes at all anymore. They outsource it. They manage the brand, but somebody else makes shoes for Nike based on Nike's design. The same thing with Body Glove. I mean, those guys don't make wetsuits anymore. They just license their brand name, and then obviously they manage that brand, but somebody else make that stuff for them. And before we even can start talking about that, one of the big questions that we have to answer is, what is outsourcing? And so there is only a very fine line between manufacturing and outsourcing. For example, if GM buys office chairs rather than makes them, would you call that outsourcing or not? And most of you probably would say, well, that's not outsourcing because General Motors doesn't make chairs, they make cars. So they just buy office supplies, so that's not a problem. But let's say they buy engine oil for its fleet of corporate cars. Would that mean that General Motors company outsources some of the components of its production or makes them? And this one is kind of tricky. I mean, oil, yeah, kind of outsources. They don't make their own oil, but that's only for the cars that run the business. Not sure, right? How about paint for the cars? How about the tires, electrical motors, windshields? Well, at that stage, it's obviously outsourcing. So they outsource manufacturing of some of the essential components of their core product, which is cars. And so the question is, where do you draw the line between outsourcing and making? And then even more importantly, which way is better? And so obviously the reasons to make all your products in-house would be that potentially it may be lower cost, because every time you outsource a product, that means that somebody is going to spend money on making it, which is roughly going to be whatever you would spend on making it, plus they want to make some profit, and you will be losing that. If you keep making stuff as well, you will have greater control over how things are made. If you remember a story from the previous lecture about Sir Dyson and his vacuum cleaners, one of the big reasons he didn't want to outsource or license his technology, because he wanted to ensure that the final product is of superior quality. And he just wasn't sure if anyone can meet those quality expectations. And eventually they chose to make those vacuum cleaners on their own. Industrial espionage is a big deal. I mean, if you outsource, there is a greater chance that your technology will be stolen. And so if you do it in-house, you have a greater control over who gets access to the information. You also have a better control over the location. You basically, choose where you make the stuff, and sometimes that may lead to savings on transportation or whatever other labor costs we discussed. But then the big challenge about making stuff yourself is that you have to be able and have the equipment and facilities to make that stuff. So you definitely wouldn't have as much flexibility if you make the things, because you have to buy all the equipment and you have to manage it. So sometimes it's much easier to find someone who will make that equipment for you. Then obviously economies of scale is a big deal. Like for example, for GM, making tires would cost a fortune. It's a huge, very expensive type of operation. And then, well, the GM is a bad example. Let's take, for example, Tesla, a small manufacturing company, make only a few cars or a few thousand cars per year at this time, right? So for them to make tires, that would be very costly. But if they buy tires, for example, from Michelin, Michelin makes millions and millions of tires, right? So for Michelin, marginal cost will be substantially lower than it would be for Tesla. And so for Tesla, obviously, it's much more less risky and much more profitable or less costly to buy tires from big tire manufacturers rather than to develop the capacity to make tires on their own, right? So you don't need to invest in the equipment, production, research and development, operations management. You just, get a contract, buy from the big guys. They make some money on you, but because of the huge operation scale that they have, they may be, even with their profit, the price to you may be substantially lower than what it would be if you had to make it all on your own. Now, another consideration when we talk about outsourcing is that at the same time when you outsource, or especially when you become the person who takes the contract from a company that outsources production, you may become very dependent on your consumers. In other words, if you make, let's say, electrical motors, right, and if, let's say, GM buys most of them for their cars, you may become too dependent on GM, and if GM threatens you to lose and go and buy motors, electrical motors from somebody else, you may be in no position to bargain or say no, and you will have to decrease the price. My favorite example is Vlasic's pickles. Vlasic used to be a self-standing, self-sustained company making cucumbers, or growing cucumbers and making all kinds of products from cucumbers. Now, at some time, Walmart approached Vlasic and said, hey guys, how about you sell your cucumbers through our stores? And in an attempt to make a statement, Walmart and Vlasic decided to sell first 1-gallon jars for about $3.50 for the whole gallon of pickles. So like for a $5 bill, you could buy your monthly supply of pickles for your family and still have some change back. And so that seemed like a good idea. Vlasic wasn't making much on those pickles. I believe the profit margin initially was about 3%. But given that Walmart placed a huge order for Vlasic, that was a sweet deal because it's not much profit compared to what they normally get when they sell their products through smaller stores. But because of the volume, it was a wonderful, profitable transaction for them, or contract. The problem is that Vlasic became more and more dependent on Walmart, and soon enough Vlasic was selling about 90% of all cucumbers they grow through Walmart. And then what Walmart did was said, well, you know what guys, maybe you're making too much money, let's reduce the profit margins for you. And as you know, Walmart sells most of its stuff at less than 1% profit margin for Walmart. In fact, there are some products that are sold like at 2.3% profit margin for Walmart, like razor thing. And that's what they also expect from their manufacturers or producers or suppliers. And so now Vlasic's profit margin is roughly 0.2%. And even though it's still a lot of profit because of the huge volume, but Vlasic can't really go anywhere else. I mean, Walmart is their not only main customer, Walmart is their virtually the only customer. Not the only, but huge customer. And so if Walmart came tomorrow to them and said that, you know what guys, now you got to operate on a 0.1% profit margin, Vlasic really wouldn't have a choice, because if they lose Walmart, they will lose almost all of their operations. And so unfortunately that's sometimes maybe a trick. So for you as a company that makes stuff and orders or outsources some of its manufacturing to other companies, the challenge is, do you want to make it yourself, or do you want to sell it through somebody, order it through somebody else? Just a second, somebody's knocking on the door. Anyway, so as I was saying, being a company that gets to make products for the companies that outsource production of those products, you may be too dependent on those companies, and you got to keep that in mind. All right. Now another big challenge is to present your product to people who are not aware of your brand or your product and may have doubts about the quality of your product. For example, when you sell your product in one country, over time people will have some idea as to how good or bad your product is. But when you go to a new market, particularly when you're selling components to larger products, for example, when you're selling tires or paint or electrical motors or windshields, and you're trying to sell your product to, for example, Chinese auto manufacturers, one big challenge you will have is that nobody knows about you there. And so how do you prove that the quality you offer is good enough? And so one of the ways to manage this problem is to go through the International Standards Organization. ISO is an organization that basically certifies companies for quality. I'm not sure if you know, but back in the Soviet Union times, there was what they called the Soviet stamp of quality. So some products would literally have a stamp that looked like a star, and so companies, state-owned companies, would apply it sometime. I'm not sure if it was mandatory or optional, but would apply for that certification. And if their product meets that quality expectations, they would have that stamp literally on their product. With ISO, they don't put the stamps, but they give you a certificate of quality. And so there are different types of certificates. The textbook talks about ISO 9000, but apparently now there is ISO 26000. But anyway, you don't need to remember all those numbers. The point is here that, again, you can apply for ISO certification, and ISO will send their experts to you, to your company, and they will not only check the quality of your products, but they will also inspect the ways you make products. They will see, you know, how you monitor quality, how you ensure that the product is of desirable quality, and if it meets standards. Moreover, they will give you a lengthy report about what can be done to improve quality of your product. And then when eventually you meet their expectations, you will get this ISO certification. And so when you now approach potential customers, either big companies or perhaps even retailers, you can say that, and by the way, my product is ISO certified, which to them will be a good proof of quality and reliability of your production process and you as a supplier. Now, here is a question about ISO for you. Now, I apologize, this is not a very good question. A, C, and D are correct, but B is not, and so you don't have a good answer. So all of the above is not really correct because B is not correct. ISO is operating from Switzerland, and apparently this is where it was originally founded in 1947. So my apology for not a perfectly coherent question. And as I said, A, C, and D are all correct statements in this case. Now, another big question for you would be, where will you get the money to finance your operations? I mean, most companies don't have enough cash at hand to finance expansion. And the challenge is that when you do business internationally, as we have discussed in this course, it may be a problem for you to find the money because your local banks will not be happy to give you money when you go overseas and spend the money overseas, because they will have no means of seizing your property overseas if something goes wrong. Then the banks from the country where you are going to may not be happy to give you money because they don't know you. You don't have credit history there. And so the challenge for you would be, where do you get the money? And so several choices or several challenges that you will have would be, or options that you will have would be: one, borrow money. And so, you know, if you can find someone who can give you money, then you can just basically get a loan. Or issue equity. You can sell your shares or shares of your company. Or you can find some sources of internal funding. Maybe your parent company from the headquarters will give you enough money so you can finance the operations in a foreign subsidiary. And so the problem, as I said, with borrowing is that nobody knows you there, and those here who have the money and would be willing normally to give you the money may not be comfortable giving the money to you, given that you go far away. And so if you know, when you buy a car here, you stop paying, they will come and take your car. But if you buy a car or a house there and stop paying, I mean, there is no easy way to come after you and get that car back, right? Now, what sometimes companies do before they have the credit history, they would go with a so-called back-to-back loan. And a back-to-back loan, in simple terms, is very simple, similar to those what we call student credit cards or prepaid credit cards. So sometimes, you know, when you're still young, and you're probably right now at this stage, where banks may not be happy or comfortable giving you credit cards because it's not sure if you will be able to pay your bills on time or not. And so what they would do is they would give you a prepaid credit card where you would have to maintain a certain amount of money in your account, and you can put on your credit card or spend with your credit card only the amount that corresponds to that amount of money that you have in your account. And so this way, even though it operates as a real credit card, as far as you know, you don't get your bill until 20, or you get your grace period. You don't have to pay your bill until it's 21 days after the billing period has closed. But at the same time, you kind of have to show the money before you can even spend it. And so the back-to-back loan almost works the same way. So your parent company deposits some money into a bank, and it can be a bank in your country or a bank where you operate, but you would be allowed to take the kind of loan only against that amount that your parent company has provided or showed. And again, there are very different variations of back-to-back loan, but that's the main idea. So it's almost like one of those prepaid cards where you kind of borrow the money, but you first have to show, or your parent company has to show, that you will be able to pay that money back. Then obviously you can issue equity. You can sell shares of your company, but one of the challenges will be that enlisting your company at the local stock exchange may not be so easy. If you operate in the United States, you can sell your company through New York Stock Exchange or whatever other exchange you go. But if you want to do business in China, it may not be so easy for you to sell shares of your company in China. And so what sometimes companies do, they use American depository receipts, and you have exactly the same types of things for other countries. So when a foreign company comes to the United States, they sometimes will not be allowed legally to list their shares on a foreign exchange, either because there may be restrictions in the country where you came, in this case in the United States, or maybe your home country may not allow you to sell your shares on a foreign market. And so what you can do is you can find a bank in the country where you want to sell your shares, and that bank will buy basically your shares, or will be entitled for a share of your company. And for that part of your company, they will issue pieces of paper that represent your company. And so effectively you sell the shares to the bank, then the bank makes pieces of paper that represent the shares that you gave to the bank. And those pieces of paper issued by the bank, local bank in the country where you're selling them, would then be sold to potential investors. And so by going through a bank, you obviously will be losing some amount of money, because the bank will want some portion of the profits. But at the same time, you will not have to go through the hassle of enlisting your company in that specific country. So the bank in this case basically exchanges your pieces of papers that represent your company for pieces of paper that represents those pieces of paper that represent your company. And so those are normally called, as I said, American depository receipts if you do it in the United States. But again, you can do the same thing in just about any other country. And by doing so, you can sell your company and basically, sell equity in your company without all the hassles of, formally going through the process of enlisting your company on a foreign exchange market. The same thing with the global depository receipts. Those would not be tied to a specific company. Those would be traded either in London or Luxembourg. And so it's essentially the same idea, but it would be a global bank that buys your shares, and it's not going to be physically buying up front. So it just exchanges the pieces of paper that you represent, that represent parts of your company, and then issues their own pieces of paper that represent the pieces of paper that represent your company, and then sell them on the global market, and anyone can buy them. And by doing so, you can easily reach basically the entire planet of potential investors. Now, here is a question for you. And the answer obviously is D. Now, you can also try to raise capital through raise capital through venture capitalists. Those people, who venture capitalists are, people who give you money for a share of your company. Normally they deal with startups, and so they believe that eventually your company will be worth more, and by giving you money now, they can have more money tomorrow. And most of the venture capitalist investments go bust, so they don't make money. But eventually, or sometimes, they would find a company like, for example, I don't know, Google or Facebook, and they would give the money to that company when it's worth nothing, when it's a dude in the dorm room doing something for fun. And so for $1,000 they would, for example, have half of the company, and then before you know it, the company is worth $30 billion, and so you made yourself a nice profit. And so most people think that venture capitalists are, people somewhere out there, and there is no way you can get access to them. But actually you do. I mean, I even had once a student who was able to raise about $2 million in 2007 from a venture capitalist. And so here is a picture of the guy. You can actually find a lot of stories about him in the press these days if you just type his name. He was my student, and originally he was born in Bulgaria, but his parents lived in China for a long time, and this is where he grew up. So he was fluent in Mandarin, and then obviously his family immigrated eventually to Canada, where he took my classes, and so he was fluent in English too. And he had an idea for a product that would be similar to Segway. Like, I'm not quite sure what exactly it was. He was never sharing all the details. But the product was designed as a transportation tool for highly populated areas. And so he was trying to raise some capital in Canada, but I mean, nobody knew him, and he wasn't able to do so. And then he went to a conference somewhere in China, and eventually went to Hong Kong, and was able to convince investors there to give him money. So it worked for Emil, and I don't see why it shouldn't work for you. Now here's a question for you. Let's see if you would know what we are talking about here. And if you remember that map with all those banks, you could definitely recognize that the correct answer to this question is back-to-back loan. Now, also, many companies may be uncomfortable listing their shares on markets of countries that have emerging economies. I mean, we know how New York Stock Exchange looks like, or Tokyo Stock Exchange, but in some countries, Stock Exchange looks like what you see on the picture there, or I guess for you it would be there or there, right? So just literally a room with a bunch of people, and that's it. I mean, this is, for example, a picture of Stock Exchange in Bhutan. Now, it may seem like not a very serious place to sell your company, but at the same time, it may be your wonderful opportunity. This is the only way people in Bhutan can invest their money in shares of companies. And so their banks, I assume, are not very stable, and many of them may well be comfortable buying shares of companies in their country, or companies from other countries operating in their countries. And due to a lack of competition, you may actually see a lot of interest in your shares, and you may be able to raise a lot of money. Don't discount that, and as I said, there may be a good army of people there with cash on hands, and maybe it's not much per person, but as a country overall, it may be billions of dollars. And unlike Americans that have many investment options, you can, your bank will probably offer you dozens of investment options, and then obviously you would have shares, bonds, and you have all kinds of things. They may not have that, and so you being a company from here may seem like a very valuable and reasonable investment to them. And so if you can sell your list your company at one of those markets, you may actually raise a lot of capital. And so obviously, again, the economy there may be less stable, and your shares may go up and down in value like crazy, but at least as a way, you shouldn't definitely discount that option. Now here's another question. And obviously the answer is B, venture capital. Now this is what you need to know on the exam. It was a short lecture, but as you saw, it has many interesting topics, particularly interested or relevant to your X-Culture project if you participate in that. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.